The person responsible for Nancy Guthrie's abduction and possible homicide, and I don't want to go there yet, we don't know for sure what happened to Nancy, but he believes it is likely someone who knew her in some way, whether that be someone who worked in her house at one point, someone she knew from going to the grocery store. I mean, could be literally anyone in that capacity, but someone who knew her based on the statistics. And he's going to go through several different statistics and research methods that he has to try to narrow down who this person is responsible for Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. What is your profile for who this suspect could be?
Realize when the narrative felt wrong. Some investigations develop with a logical progression that almost seems rational, even in their tragedy. You track the evidence, reconstruct the timeline, and watch one choice trigger the next. And then there are anomalies like this. Inquiries that feel fractured from the start, like a jigsaw where the pieces never fit. Nancy Guthrie was the last person anyone expected to find at the heart of a violent felony investigation. At 84 years old, she led a quiet life, defined by a rigid, unchanging routine, the kind of existence that avoids notice. No public record, no conflict, and zero known enemies. If you had to define her with a single word, it would be ordinary. That unremarkable nature makes her victimization so jarring. Typically, targeted violence leaves a footprint. You expect a trail of disputes, overt threats, or financial instability that heightens tension before the eventual breaking point. But here, the record was empty. No documented quarrels or clear motives for an attack, just a peaceful residence shattered by sudden, unexplained violence. The investigation pivoted on the video. An intruder surfaced in the pre-dawn hours, navigating the grounds with a level of composure that defied expectation. He never hurried. He showed zero hesitation and no signs of second-guessing himself. Each stride appeared calculated and deliberate, as if he had rehearsed this sequence internally long before his actual arrival. That mechanical efficiency was deeply unsettling. Fear almost always leaves a psychological footprint. Even veteran offenders betray nerves through subtle tells. A paranoid look, a jagged motion, or a tactical error that compromised the mission. But this intruder exhibited none of that. Instead, he moved as if he owned the property. This anomaly forced Brian to stop. He had analyzed countless hours of security footage, yet this recording felt different. It sparked a growing discomfort that intensified with every viewing. The issue was not merely the man's action, it was his execution. The intruder was sluggishly methodical, entirely focused, and remarkably unbothered by his surroundings. It was as if the threat of detection was non-existent. Such absolute certainty is never accidental. Brian began his interrogation of the facts. He consulted with primary sources and analyzed the initial law enforcement hypotheses. Initially, the motive seemed standard. Investigators considered a simple home invasion or robbery. Perhaps an opportunist hoped to seize valuables and vanish undetected. These types of property crimes occur with high frequency daily. However, that robbery narrative collapsed the moment forensic teams processed the crime scene. No assets were missing. There were zero signs of a ransacked interior or a frantic search for currency. Theft was never the objective. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was the clinical execution of a specific agenda. The focus shifted. Could this be a rare instance of purely random, unpredictable violence? Perhaps a transient offender selected a victim based on nothing more than proximity or bad luck. It is a convenient theory used when logic fails. Yet, that explanation did not satisfy the investigators. Arbitrary attacks are notoriously disorganized and chaotic. They are messy, high-risk, and reactive. The individual responsible usually improvises as the situation changes. Again, the evidence here suggested the exact opposite profile. The offender was focused, and as Brian analyzed the behavior, a single question intensified. If the motive wasn't random or financial, then what was the driver? Seeking answers, he pivoted toward a more scientific investigation. He stopped chasing flimsy theories and contacted an expert who spent years analyzing the metrics of violent crime. This specialist ignored intuition and gut feelings, focusing strictly on forensic data, raw numbers, and objective outcomes. He engaged Dr. Gary Brucato, a forensic psychologist specializing in the behavioral analysis of violence. Brucato specializes in decoding how violent offenders operate, avoiding generalizations in favor of deep, methodical profiling. His research prioritizes behavioral analysis over simple logistics, examining what was done, the execution, and the underlying motive. He believed the key to breaking a case like this wasn't starting with who, it was starting with why. Once you identify the motive, the field of suspects starts to narrow, not instantly, but enough to build momentum. A clearer picture begins to emerge. So he started there, systematically breaking the facts into specific forensic categories. He analyzed the common drivers for this type of felony, ignoring speculation and focusing strictly on the hard data. He focused on real-world statistics. The first potential motive he examined was a sexual assault. This is a leading driver for stranger home invasions, but he immediately identified a significant tactical problem. These offenses follow rigid patterns and are rarely isolated incidents because these offenders tend to repeat their behaviors. They typically target a specific victim profile, yet in this investigation, the known behavioral profile just didn't fit. Selecting an elderly victim for that reason wasn't just uncommon, it was statistically rare and highly unlikely to occur. It made no sense to treat it as the primary theory, particularly when the crime scene showed no evidence. With no supporting evidence, that theory was discarded, leaving robbery as the next plausible explanation on the list. Financial gain drives most residential burglaries, with intruders hunting for cash, expensive jewelry, or electronics they can flip. They want items that convert to fast currency, yet something felt wrong here. Absolutely nothing had been stolen. Crucially, the suspect's actions didn't mirror someone seeking money. There was a complete lack of tactical urgency. He showed no panic or hurried movements. Instead, the individual on the surveillance footage acted like time was completely irrelevant. That contradicts typical robbery behavior because when the goal is theft, the offender wants to breach and clear. They need to exit quickly because every second spent inside increases the risk of detection or a violent confrontation. This intruder seemed indifferent to those risks, prompting a new question: what if money was only one component? Could cash be a secondary motive? That was when the possibility of a targeted abduction finally took center stage. This theory suggested someone breached the residence specifically to take Nancy alive and hold her for ransom or leverage. A kidnapping explained why no valuables were missing and accounted for the intense level of control the suspect maintained. Despite the surveillance evidence, that theory had flaws because legitimate ransom scenarios usually follow a very specific protocol. There is typically contact within 48 hours, a ransom demand, proof of life, and instructions for the payout. The perpetrator wants to collect the money and release the hostage as fast as possible to minimize their exposure. Speed reduces their risk, but that pattern was absent here. There was no demand and no attempt at communication. There was only a heavy silence, and in a kidnapping investigation, that silence is often the most revealing evidence. It indicates the original plan likely collapsed, shifting the focus of the investigation toward what exactly went sideways. They stopped analyzing the suspect's intent and started looking for errors because the truth usually hides in the failures. The real story isn't in the strategy, but in the chaos when it breaks. As Brian reviewed the case files, he couldn't shake one persistent thought: this crime did not look like it had been executed according to plan. Initially, the video evidence suggested a disciplined offender who moved with deliberate purpose and showed absolutely no hesitation. He seemed like a professional, but a broader look at the entire timeline told a far more complicated story. The footage was just one piece. The subsequent events painted a much more disturbing picture. If this were a professional hit or abduction, there would be results, a ransom note, or a clear message. We should have seen a calculated next step, yet everything ground to a halt the second she was taken. There was no direction or logical follow-up, only a fragmented trail, massive confusion, and a growing list of inconsistencies. These unanswered questions were glaring, and this type of radio silence never occurs during a successful criminal operation. It only happens when a plan fails. Brian had analyzed enough cold cases to understand common human reactions. Without a logical explanation, the public and investigators begin filling the void. Some people lean towards sensational theories. Others assume it was random violence, but Dr. Brucato ignored those impulses and focused strictly on historical patterns. One behavioral pattern was undeniable. When a targeted crime starts with precision but suddenly loses its structural integrity, that loss of structure usually indicates an interrupted objective. Something went wrong. Something completely unexpected occurred. The suspects encountered a variable they hadn't trained for, which is where the theory of a failed kidnapping starts. If the primary goal was a high-stakes abduction for profit, the initial phase of the break-in makes sense. Breach the home, secure the victim, and extract quietly. They snatch the victim and vanish before a soul notices. It is a calculated tactic, but success hinges on one single critical factor. Total precision is required. In the real world, things rarely go to plan. A grandmother alone at home looks like a soft target. People are not static objects. They fight back. They scream. They resist in ways that defy even the most careful criminal planning. A simple slip, a heavy fall, or a muffled shout at the exact wrong moment is enough to shatter the entire operation. Once the script breaks, the situation spirals into chaos. Dr. Brucato broke it down clinically, stripping away any sense of Hollywood drama. He replaced tension with cold logic. If the objective was a live kidnapping, the perpetrators would have handled her with extreme care. This is not about compassion, it is about logistics. In that scenario, she is the only valuable asset in the entire room. Harming her compromises the leverage. Yet, the forensic evidence from the scene did not point toward that kind of tactical caution. Subtle physical markers remained, suggesting that something went fundamentally wrong during the struggle inside that house. When a plan collapses, the offenders are forced to improvise. They have to make high-stakes decisions on the fly. These are variables they never anticipated. That is the breaking point. Once the primary goal is off the table, their focus shifts. The objective changes from profit to pure damage control. That is when this entire investigation takes a darker turn. If Nancy was no longer useful for their original endgame, her status changed. She became something else entirely to her captors. She ceased to be leverage and became a liability, a problem to solve, a witness, a loose end that needed cutting. Historically, that is when the most brutal decisions are finalized. Brian had enough field experience to know exactly what that meant. He understood the grim reality. Yet, even with that logic, one piece of this puzzle still refused to click into place. Even with a failed abduction and a spiraling crime scene, there should have been some sort of noise in the aftermath. Panic leaves tracks. People talk and mistakes happen. Someone gets nervous. Someone always slips up. Yet the investigation met only silence. No tips came in. There was zero effort to profit from the crime or negotiate. No one tried to turn the situation to their advantage. There were no demands, no leverage, and no visible payoff. A major question remained. If the motive was money, where was the follow-through? Dr. Brucato had a different theory, and it was grim. When a crime abandons logic, the nature of the act changes. If the behavior does not match the stated motive, there is usually a hidden, darker agenda driving the suspect. It suggests a personal connection that is not immediately visible. He used a very specific forensic term for it. Elimination. It is a harsh word, but in the world of criminal psychology, the meaning is precise and absolute. Occasionally, a victim becomes a hurdle, not because of their actions, but because of the threat their existence poses. They represent a secret or a potential exposure. In those cases, the crime is not about profit or ransom. It is about permanent removal. The difficulty is that most people do not want that to be the truth. We prefer to fear the random stranger, someone with zero ties to the victim. It feels safer that way. It keeps the threat at arm's length. However, the cold, hard statistics do not offer that kind of psychological comfort. The data consistently points toward a single conclusion. Most victims are targeted by someone already within their social circle. It might not be a close bond, but there is enough of a link to establish a dangerous level of familiarity. That familiarity allows a suspect to study routines, identify security gaps, and strike exactly when the victim is most vulnerable. This case showed clear markers of that insight. The intruder moved with total confidence and zero hesitation during the crime. This was not a person stepping into the unknown. It looked like someone who had mapped out the entire house. They understood the environment and did not need to guess. Precision like that never happens by sheer accident. It only happens with prior knowledge. That realization is where the focus of the investigation began to shift again. The focus moved beyond that night's violence and toward the history of anyone who had entered that home. Detectives looked at everyone with past access, people who saw the interior, people who understood the layout of the property. They knew the routines and small details that outsiders miss. It did not have to be a close personal bond. It could be a temporary contractor, a service worker, or even someone who just passed through for a single day. A seemingly unimportant face. Those are precisely the types of casual connections that investigators often overlook in the beginning. They are ignored because they seem insignificant. In a case like this, those background characters can be everything. Brian weighed the radius of the search. How far out do you look? Do you cast a massive net? Or do you concentrate on a tight inner circle where the probability of finding the killer is much higher? High probability? Dr. Brucato focused on that second theory. The goal was targeted search, not a wide net. This was intelligence-led work. If the suspect displayed such extreme comfort and control, it suggested a deep familiarity. A critical fact. He wasn't some drifter passing through. In some way, the man belonged there. Maybe not in plain sight or recognized by neighbors, but enough to feel completely at home. That changes the framework. Once you accept the perpetrator wasn't a stranger, the whole case shifts. The investigation transforms. Inquiries get sharp and hyper-focused. It's no longer about what happened, but who. It's about access and opportunity. Yet, even with that shift in strategy, critical gaps remained in the record. Evidence was missing, and the holes were impossible to ignore. Chief among them, the massive reward money. Over $1 million. That is life-altering wealth. It is the exact kind of financial incentive that usually works. It breaks silence. It forces accomplices to weigh loyalty against a fortune, and yet, total radio silence. Not one credible tip arrived to break the case. No one stepped out of the shadows to provide any actionable leverage. That's wrong. In scenarios involving multiple players, which seemed increasingly likely, loyalty is a fragile thing. When pressure mounts and fear takes over, people crack. That is the standard psychology of criminal associations. Someone always talks eventually. But here, nothing. This suggested a much darker possibility for the investigation. What if the silence wasn't about loyalty? What if they weren't afraid of the police at all? What if they feared each other? In multi-actor crimes, the internal dynamics are a zero-sum game. It becomes about leverage, power, secrets, and liabilities. Who has the most to lose if the truth breaks? Often, the threat isn't the law, it's the partner. That level of terror overrides any financial reward. Money can't buy courage when your life is on the line. This implies a far more structured conspiracy. The situation was far larger than it appeared. Not theatrical, but deeply layered and strategically complex. This wasn't a lone wolf. We are talking about divided roles and a clear chain of command. One mind plans, another hand executes. The theory had been there, but now the forensic evidence supported it. Brian re-examined the surveillance footage and caught a subtle detail. The man on tape wasn't the lead. He lacked authority. He looked like an operative following orders. His movements were confident, sure, but lacked precision. He wasn't sharp like a primary architect. He didn't show the meticulous nature of a mastermind. Inconsistencies started showing in the forensic timeline. Visible signs suggested he wasn't calling the shots. If true, a handler was operating behind the scenes. A second person, someone who managed the risk and had the motive, yet never appeared on camera. This realization changed the narrative. The story wasn't just about the events of that specific night. It was about the countdown, every decision and tactical choice leading to the point of no return. Every whispered conversation where the conspiracy took root. If that plan didn't originate from a stranger, then it started very close to home. The investigation was now morphing into something far more dangerous. A home invasion had evolved into a community-wide obsession. Public speculation was now fueling the official narrative. Speculation grew. There was a nagging feeling that the core truth was still buried. The question wasn't what happened anymore. It was why. Why did none of the physical evidence align? Most violent crimes follow a specific internal logic. It isn't moral or acceptable, but a clear, identifiable motive is usually visible. There is always a purpose behind the risk. Even a flawed reason gives investigators a trail to follow. Usually there's a clear motive you can identify, but in this case that forensic clarity was missing. We only had contradictions. The suspect's calm demeanor didn't fit the violent outcome of the crime. No urgency, which ruled out a robbery. Total silence, which ruled out a typical ransom abduction. These conflicting facts couldn't coexist. The longer they sat, the more they pointed toward an inside job. Dr. Brucato was adamant. You don't close a file like this by spreading your resources thin. You focus on probability. It doesn't guarantee a conviction, but it provides the only viable path forward. It's the highest chance of success. Statistically, the culprit wasn't hiding in some distant, unknown corner. They were close. Much closer than anyone wanted to admit. That reality made everyone extremely uneasy. This realization confirmed the suspect wasn't some drifting stranger. Instead, they lived right within arm's reach, inhabiting the same physical space and social networks of daily life. Once that grim possibility takes root, investigative questions sharpen. Who had earned her trust? Who held a physical key? Who had a motive, however minuscule? Crossing a boundary this severe rarely looks like a sudden explosion. In fact, the signs are usually buried. Violence often bypasses public outbursts or screaming matches. Frequently, the catalyst is something far quieter, perhaps a long festering grudge or a spike of resentment that refused to die, creating a lethal situation where a person felt slighted, ignored, or cast out. These internal fractures rarely manifest in the open. Still, they never vanish. They remain submerged beneath a calm exterior until a specific trigger ignites them. When that pressure finally breaks, the result often defies public expectations, presenting one of the most difficult challenges in profiling these murders. They aren't born of sudden chaos. Rather, they emerge from cold, methodical calculation. Brian heard conflicting profiles of the suspect. Some labeled him reckless, while others viewed his actions as bold. A few witnesses suggested he was an amateur who spiraled out of control, but when you actually strip away the labels and analyze the core behavior, a different pattern emerges. He wasn't just reacting, he was executing. Every movement carried lethal intent, including the minor gestures that initially appeared to be total nonsense to the untrained eye. A mechanical rhythm drove his actions, an internal cadence, suggesting that he wasn't simply improvising his way through the crime scene. Every step was premeditated. This leads to a critical question that investigators far too often fail to ask. When someone orchestrates an attack like this, how do they reach that threshold? Premeditation involves far more than the event. It involves the entire lead-up, the internal logic, the mental justification, and the exact moment a moral boundary is breached. The violation begins in the mind long before the first strike. Once that mental barrier breaks, the execution becomes easier. Not effortless, but easier. The offender stops weighing the morality of the act and begins focusing purely on the logistics. That psychological shift separates a crime of passion from cold intent. Here, the evidence of planning was impossible to ignore. Despite the apparent planning, certain anomalies remained. Most notably, the strange behavior captured by the local security cameras. During the recording, the suspect engages in an almost absurd action, interacting with his surroundings in a highly conspicuous way. He intentionally draws focus through an unnecessary movement that offers no tactical advantage toward completing his objective. This moment shatters the illusion of total control. If the goal is evasion, why risk exposure with such a blatant act? Why invite detection? Why introduce a variable that serves no logical purpose? That specific question plagued the entire investigation. According to forensic experts like Dr. Brucato, these nonsensical details are critical. When a subject's behavior seems entirely irrational, it typically points to two possibilities. Either the killer was exceptionally careless, or a hidden motive remains to be uncovered. In professional profiling, the latter is usually true. High-stakes offenders do not take unnecessary risks without a deep-seated reason. Though the motive isn't immediately obvious or seems insane to an outsider, there is always an underlying psychological driver present. A singular belief or a distorted logic that functions only within their fractured worldview. Until the police can grasp that twisted perspective, the action remains an anomaly. This gap in understanding makes these homicide cases incredibly difficult. The challenge isn't a lack of forensic evidence, but a total lack of context. Evidence merely maps the crime. Context explains the motive. Without a clear why, the facts remain fragmented. Brian began analyzing this disconnect. He looked past the suspect's physical movements and attempted to reconstruct the actual thought process behind the violence. What internal dialogue was running? Was he momentarily distracted? Or was he pursuing a very specific, hidden objective? Was this step part of a broader scheme or a simple mistake that would later become a critical lead? Every potential theory sparked a different set of conclusions, and each lead pointed toward a new investigative path. However, every scenario shared a common thread. They all suggested the case was far more complex than it appeared. Then came the complications regarding the notes, a series of messages that surfaced shortly after the initial incident. Some detectives believed in their authenticity, while others dismissed them as noise from attention seekers inserting themselves into the investigation for fame or profit. If even a single message was genuine, the entire profile shifted. Direct communication exposes intent. It is rarely honest or transparent, yet it provides enough forensic data to build on. One specific detail remained jarring. The tone simply didn't align with the expected profile of the killer. The linguistic structure of the message suggested a perpetrator with a vastly different background than originally suspected. The behavior felt almost human. It was jarring because it failed to align with the brutal nature of the offense. This profile clashed with the mental image of a perpetrator committed to such violence, suggesting a hidden layer of psychology. A softer element existed that felt entirely out of place, creating a sharp contradiction that investigators simply could not ignore. Violent offenders rarely oscillate between such psychological extremes, making this sudden shift from cold aggression to something else suspicious. They do not pivot from absolute control to genuine empathy or from violence to reflection without a profound internal catalyst. If this behavioral shift was real, it suggested a complex dynamic, perhaps indicating that multiple people were operating together. Multiple mindsets appeared to be at work here, reinforcing the theory that the suspect captured on camera was not acting alone. He functioned within a larger criminal structure with divided roles, where one person strategized while another executed the physical tasks. Others likely played minor roles in the periphery, and through this lens, the glaring inconsistencies in behavior finally begin to align. Different actors bring unique behaviors and stress responses, creating fluctuating levels of control across the entire criminal operation. One individual remains composed while another becomes erratic. One focuses on the objective while a third might hesitate or falter. When these conflicting personalities overlap, the scene appears chaotic, yet a rigid underlying pattern remains visible to the trained eye. Identifying that pattern is crucial, making the concept of a criminal hierarchy central to the forensic investigation. Responsibility is never distributed equally among participants, since some are clearly followers while others provide the primary leadership. Leaders usually remain out of view, avoiding any unnecessary risks that could lead to their immediate identification. They operate from the background, ensuring they are never in a position where they can be easily seen or identified. While this makes them elusive, their influence is undeniable, manifesting through the clinical precision of the planning and the final execution. Influence shows in the structure and logistics, dictating exactly how every phase of the event eventually unfolded. Close examination reveals where this influence exists, showing how it shaped the overall structure of the criminal act. Brian questioned if they were chasing the wrong shadow, looking for the physical perpetrator instead of the mind behind them. The architect of the crime remained the true priority, because focusing on a visible suspect ignores the deeper, more dangerous layers. A narrow focus might provide minor answers, but the full story remains buried, leaving the case permanently stalled and incomplete. This realization forced him to look beneath the surface, moving away from obvious facts toward a more sophisticated psychological reality. As he scrutinized the details, it became obvious that this investigation spanned far beyond the events of a single night. It was the culmination of every quiet choice, every missed connection, and every minor event that seemed trivial at the time. Those moments were actually critical links in a chain, and by now, the case had moved far beyond any simple explanation. It was no longer just about a break-in or a disappearance, but a complex, multi-layered failed operation. The weight of the case grew as every new detail widened the gap instead of closing it, creating more tactical uncertainty. Every tactical answer generated two more questions, and for Brian, this lack of resolution was becoming the most frustrating obstacle. Usually, after following a lead this long, patterns emerge and the noise fades, allowing the critical details to surface. Vital evidence should have pointed toward a clear conclusion, yet in this instance the investigation's direction shifted with every discovery. These shifts were subtle rather than chaotic, yet they were consistent enough to keep the truth just out of reach. This meant something was missing, not just a piece of physical evidence, but a fundamental part of the puzzle. It was a deeper piece of understanding, a perspective that had not yet come into full clinical focus. Dr. Brucato had previously alluded to this, suggesting that a lack of perspective was the primary obstacle to solving the case. Once you grasp the underlying premise and the true motivation behind the act, the most confusing details begin to make sense. Strange anomalies are explained, contradictions align, and what originally appeared to be random noise begins to feel like a deliberate intent. Without that core premise, every fact feels disconnected, prompting Brian to analyze the entire case from a completely different tactical angle. He started asking, what would make this logical? What explanation could connect these pieces without being forced? He sought a theory that accounted for every detail without manipulation, searching for a narrative that remained consistent under forensic scrutiny. The primary target stood out as a glaring anomaly, raising the question of why Nancy was chosen for this specific crime. It was a complex problem because a close analysis showed the move didn't fit with a standard or purely financial motive. If financial gain was the goal, there were far easier and safer targets that wouldn't attract such an intense police response. Nancy's visibility made everything far more complicated, ensuring that her family and the media would provide an immediate spotlight. This spotlight followed her disappearance, a consequence any planner would have known before they ever put the scheme into motion. To gain entry, they had to calculate the immense risk, yet they chose Nancy as their target. Intentionality is the key here, because a move this bold requires a motive that outweighs the risk. Frequently, that motive remains obscured, buried deep within a minor interaction or a sequence of previous encounters. It might be an overlooked conversation or a social link that no one bothered to scrutinize at the time. Those are the surgical details that stay invisible until the investigation knows where to apply pressure. Investigators pivoted inward, focusing exclusively on those who had entered Nancy's orbit and shared her physical space during that time. This meant vetting anyone with access to her property or those who had documented her daily movements and routines. Familiarity isn't always built on intimacy. Often, it is forged through calculated observation from a distance. Small moments accumulate over time, and once an intruder gains that insight, their tactical approach fundamentally changes. Their cognition shifts, creating a level of confidence that was clearly visible throughout the security footage. Yet a deeper layer remained untouched, suggesting the scope of this crime was far wider than assumed. Evidence hinted that the original intent might have been something entirely different from the final outcome. Observers usually obsess over the final abduction or the break-in, ignoring the long lead-up to the event. Those visible acts are just the surface, but the true weight of the case lies in the preliminary planning. We must analyze the early logistics, the private discussions, and the exact second the conspiracy took root. Multiple suspects change the math entirely because group dynamics introduce volatile psychological variables into the equation. Collaboration adds perspectives and influence, but it also creates immense internal pressure and high levels of instability. While one person hesitates, another pushes the limit, creating a friction between caution and total recklessness. When those clashing egos collide, the operation shifts beyond their control, and that is precisely how things collapse. The plan wasn't inherently flawed. The individuals simply weren't aligned, an idea that Brian continued to examine. It resolved a nagging suspicion regarding the data. The discord wasn't in the narrative, but in the specifics. Certain movements lacked the professional control seen in other sequences, making the subject's actions feel fundamentally off. These subtle errors were enough to provoke questions, and such forensic inconsistencies usually point to a specific reality. They indicate multiple decision-makers who were operating with different levels of authority. If true, this crime wasn't the brainchild of one mind, but a collective effort born of collaboration. It was a cold process, a strict sequence of choices made by a team of individuals. This complexity makes the trail harder to follow, though a central figure almost always drives the group. There is always one individual who owns the vision and dictates the strategy. That leader leaves a unique forensic imprint within the structure of the crime rather than on the surface. You see it in the execution and the specific priorities that govern every tactical choice made. Brian re-examined the evidence through that lens, and the entire perspective of the case shifted. The man on the tape didn't fit that profile. He was capable, but lacked surgical precision. Subtle indicators suggested he wasn't the strategist or the one thinking 10 moves ahead. He was an asset acting in the moment, a physical tool rather than a designer. The truth wasn't in his actions, but in the hidden motive driving his presence at the scene. Attention turned toward the unseen figures who positioned him there, shifting the entire investigation focus back into the shadows. These are the participants who avoided every lens and left no physical evidence in the obvious areas. While they dictate the final outcome, they remain the most difficult targets for investigators to identify. They camouflage themselves as ordinary citizens, using a facade of trust to mask their lethal efficiency. Despite this new direction, the aftermath of the crime still contained specific elements that did not align with a logical plan. Regardless of the planning involved, the post-crime phase is where the structural integrity usually fails. Human beings react, they make mistakes, and their behavior shifts in ways that are visible to the observant eye. These behavioral cracks manifest quickly in group settings because the internal pressure is never distributed equally among the participants. Some subjects manage the stress while others reach a breaking point much faster than anticipated. And when they do, opportunities finally emerge. Often, a breakthrough refuses to emerge from physical evidence alone. Instead, it originates from human observation. Critical progress hinges on an individual identifying a subtle, recurring behavioral pattern. A witness finally bridges the gap between a stray detail and a logical conclusion. This is the exact point where public intervention becomes tactical, not through general noise, but through targeted insight. Success often relies on a single person experiencing a sudden, sharp moment of total recognition. Consider the mechanics of a gait, the specific swing of limbs, or a distinct physical posture. Biological markers are difficult to manipulate. While masks and wardrobe changes work, deep-seated muscle memory remains. Disguising a natural movement is nearly impossible, and for a close associate, that visual cue is sufficient. It is enough to trigger a dormant memory and transform a lingering doubt into concrete forensic suspicion. Brian recognized the theory, the firm conviction, that a viewer had already analyzed this surveillance footage. They saw something familiar, perhaps not consciously, but as a deep, intuitive physiological response. A nagging sensation of familiarity exists, though the logical pieces have not yet locked into place. If this theory held, then the solution remained buried far beyond the reach of standard lab evidence. The truth lived within people, residing in mundane interactions and those silent flashes where recognition finally strikes. Consequently, lead investigators often release controlled portions of intel, not the full file, but enough to prompt sufficient data to spark a realization. Once that circuit closes, the entire investigation accelerates toward a conclusion. However, transparency introduces severe operational risks, as excessive disclosure can permanently compromise a sensitive criminal case. Oversharing generates false leads and mass confusion, an outcome that presents a very real danger in this complex environment. Strategic balance becomes vital. Decisions must be made on what to disclose and what remains strictly confidential. Calculating which secrets to sacrifice for momentum is a brutal process with no easy or obvious answers. These choices are rarely obvious, yet they dictate the trajectory of the hunt in ways that aren't immediately apparent. Brian understood the stakes, acknowledging one reality. Time inevitably alters every single tactical variable. It affects the file and the witnesses alike. The longer a case stalls, the more psychological pressure accumulates. Tension mounts internally and in total silence, eventually demanding a release valve before the structural integrity fails. This stress does not evaporate. It manifests through erratic behavior, poor decision-making, and critical tactical mistakes. When those errors occur, the case shifts dramatically, not due to a planned operation, but through human instability. It happens because the burden becomes unbearable. Eventually, the truth forces its way to the surface through sheer necessity. Time remains the ultimate factor, methodically changing every single variable in the process. Chronology refines the investigative path, while fundamentally eroding the resolve of everyone involved. As a case remains open, it slowly recedes, blending into the static noise of everyday existence for most people. Initial reports dominate the media cycle and public speculation, but eventually, the high-intensity interest begins a slow fade. The story never vanishes entirely, yet it retreats enough for the general public to move forward, at least superficially. Underneath the quiet, pressure never lifts. It only compounds for the detectives on the case. This specific strain originates from the urgent mandate to resolve an enigma that actively resists every forensic effort. While civilians feel the discomfort of uncertainty, those closer to the center carry a far more lethal psychological burden. Despite meticulous planning, no suspect can maintain perfect self-control forever. Eventually, the human element takes over. One factor always remains beyond a person's reach: their own subconscious. Brian had witnessed this breaking point many times. Investigations that appeared impenetrable in the early stages often began to fracture due to subtle shifts in human behavior. Minor deviations coalesce into a suspicious pattern, such as a suspect abruptly retreating into total isolation without explanation. Sudden, unforced changes in daily routine, erratic financial spending, or an over-the-top reaction to mundane events signal a shift. These anomalies prove nothing in isolation. However, when viewed together, they form a damning narrative of guilty conscience. When tangible physical evidence reaches its limit, behavioral patterns become the most critical weapon in a detective's arsenal. Humans leave both forensic and behavioral imprints, but psychological traces are significantly more difficult to scrub than DNA. Dr. Brucato focused her analysis on the theory that the perpetrator was a local entity residing within a contained radius. True recognition is rarely instantaneous. That delay is where the investigation becomes truly dangerous. Breakthroughs require time, repetition, and eventually a specific psychological trigger to force the truth out. It is a moment where reality finally clicks: a voice, a glance, or a memory that locks everything together. That is how cold cases begin to turn, moving in small, nearly invisible shifts rather than all at once. Brian focused on those at the margins, ignoring the primary suspects who had already been cleared by investigators. He looked for the observers living on the periphery, those who move through a crime scene without being noticed. Often, Those individuals see the most because they are watching while remaining completely unobserved themselves. They catch the tactical details because their survival depends on constant situational awareness. In this investigation, that group is vital, especially if the killer was a local familiar with the area. If the offender navigated this environment with total confidence, there is a high probability a witness saw him before, perhaps not clearly, but just enough to leave a lingering impression of something recognizable and familiar. Recognition rarely arrives with absolute certainty. It begins as a gut feeling or a sudden, sharp hesitation. It is that quiet realization that the facts do not add up, and if that feeling is strong enough, it forces action. One anonymous tip or a minor detail can suddenly lock into place within the larger investigative picture. That is how forensic momentum builds, though in this specific case, that progress had not gone public yet. This raised a clinical question. Why has no one come forward with the information that changes the game? Statistically, silence rarely lasts in a multi-person crime. Eventually, the pressure forces someone to break. Someone slips up or realizes that the danger of staying quiet outweighs the risk of talking to police. When massive amounts of cash are involved, like the major reward offered here, the incentive to flip is high. Yet, the continued silence suggested a deeper psychological barrier that money alone could not penetrate. It was more than financial. It was fear, a word that kept surfacing during every interview. Not the fear of handcuffs, but the fear of violent consequences far outside the law. In a rigid hierarchy where one individual holds absolute power, the group dynamics become incredibly volatile. Subordinates in that structure do not just fear the FBI, they fear the person standing right above them. They fear the architect who planned the job, the one who knows everything and has everything to lose. That level of terror can buy total silence, even with a $1 million reward sitting right on the table. Cash means nothing if you are not safe enough to spend it, and that added a heavy layer. This suggested the crime was not just a random opportunity, it was an exercise in absolute control. That control extended far beyond the crime scene, and if someone was still pulling the strings, it meant they were still watching, still present, and still dangerous. That is an unsettling reality. But for career criminals, this is standard. They do not just vanish after committing a violent act. They return to their routines and conversations as if nothing happened, as if their environment was unchanged. Internally, however, the damage is done, and that shift in psychology eventually leaks out. It manifests in minor reactions or flawed decisions when the psychological pressure becomes impossible to manage. Brian imagined that weight building up daily, quietly eroding the suspect's composure without anyone noticing. The longer a case goes cold, the more it stays in the background of a small community. It is something the public stops discussing, but the witnesses never truly forget. For the person responsible, that heavy, lingering presence is a prison they cannot escape. The threat is internal. It is the constant knowledge that the job remains unfinished. One slip or a single forensic mistake could still bring the entire structure down. That weight never fades, and eventually it alters their behavior, which is exactly where investigators focus their attention. They look for what changed afterward, who acted out of character or suddenly seemed out of place. Whose reactions failed to match the gravity of the situation? These questions become critical as time passes. These details point toward human behavior, which often reveals more than physical evidence ever could. Human behavior is flawed. No matter how careful the planning, there are always forensic cracks. Regardless of how perfect they think the plan was, forensic cracks always form, and in a high-stakes investigation like these, fractures aren't obvious at first glance, remaining hidden until the light hits them from just the right angle. These discrepancies wait for a focused investigator to bridge the gaps, proving that the passage of time works in two separate directions. Years can turn a hot trail into a frozen dead end, yet those same decades can also strip away the lies. Forensic evidence eventually surfaces through the rot, forcing what was once buried back into the harsh light of a courtroom. The momentum shifts slowly before a single breakthrough accelerates the entire investigation, ensuring that the wheels of justice finally begin to turn. One minor detail or a brief moment of forensic clarity is often the only catalyst required to break the case. Brian understood the reality. He knew that high-profile homicides never resolve themselves within a single news cycle. These cold cases demand extreme patience and a high tolerance for ambiguity, but ultimately, the entire process relies on human testimony. Regardless of the tactical complexity or digital evidence involved, the core of the mystery always returns to a fundamental human element. A witness possesses the missing piece of the puzzle, even if they currently believe their specific knowledge is completely irrelevant. When that mental barrier finally collapses, the investigation gains permanent traction and the long-standing wall of silence begins to crumble. Verified facts inevitably follow that breakthrough, signaling the point where a standard police inquiry transforms into a high-stakes legal pursuit. The situation shifts into a tactical waiting game, though significant activity continues to hum beneath the surface of the official record. This period is characterized by a controlled, deliberate silence where every investigative move is calculated to avoid tipping off the suspect. Each executive decision is critical now, and every fragment of raw intelligence must be handled with surgical precision to ensure admissibility. The focus has shifted away from the unknown gaps and toward the mountain of circumstantial evidence already logged into the file. Everything hinges on connecting these data points correctly, a difficult phase that Brian had navigated before without ever finding it easy. A thick psychological tension takes hold when the solution feels imminent, yet remains just outside the perimeter of a formal arrest. It resembles standing in a pitch-black room, sensing a presence nearby, while the visual confirmation remains frustratingly out of sight. The proximity of the truth is palpable, yet there is still insufficient probable cause to execute a warrant with total certainty. The investigation had reached this critical impasse, where microscopic forensic details suddenly carry the weight of a full murder conviction. Anomalies that were previously dismissed, like a nervous tic or an inconsistent statement, are now scrutinized as potential signs of guilt. Every outlier is pulled back under the microscope, because when the broad narrative fails to align, the truth usually hides in the margins. Brian obsessively reviewed the case file, constantly asking himself what crucial element the task force had managed to overlook thus far. This was not about a missed piece of physical evidence, but rather a failure to properly interpret the psychological profile of the killer. The smoking gun had been sitting in the evidence locker all along, just waiting for the correct situational context to be applied. Without that specific context, the investigation feels disjointed, leaving surveillance footage as nothing more than a series of grainy, meaningless images. Erratic behavior remains unexplained, and the dots refuse to connect until a clear motive suddenly brings the entire crime into focus. The bizarre elements of the crime scene finally become logical, and a structured timeline of events begins to emerge with terrifying clarity. Dr. Brucato stated it plainly, noting that once the underlying premise is identified, the surrounding chaos finally begins to align. Identifying that core premise remains the most difficult task because it forces investigators to abandon initial theories and start from scratch. It demands a willingness to accept that the ultimate resolution could be far different from the profile originally constructed by the feds. For this specific file, it meant facing a harsh reality that this homicide was driven by something far deeper than mere criminal opportunity. The motive transcended financial gain, and this was certainly not a botched robbery where a simple plan had accidentally turned lethal. The core issue was deliberate intent, a dark psychological seed planted months before the perpetrator ever laid a finger on the victim. Calculated murders do not start with a forced entry. They originate much earlier in the quiet, dark recesses of a cold and decisive mind. The process begins when the offender internally justifies their actions, convincing themselves that violence is the only logical solution to their problems. That is the genesis of the crime, and once that psychological momentum builds, the violent impulses evolve into a rigid, unstoppable plan. The mind creates a false sense of logic until the moral boundary that once seemed absolute simply disappears under the weight of obsession. This internal descent remains invisible to the public, occurring in the shadows where surveillance cameras and digital footprints cannot follow. While this mental preparation leaves no DNA or fingerprints, it is very real and dictates the brutal outcome of the crime scene. Brian considered the distinct possibility that the public would never truly grasp the illogical factors that drove this specific killer. It wasn't that the case was unsolvable, but rather that the motive was rooted in a highly personal, incomprehensible level of petty resentment. The catalyst might only be understandable to the players involved, a reality that occurs in domestic homicides far more frequently than realized. A logical explanation might exist, yet it rarely feels satisfying. The motive fails to match the sheer scale of the violence, providing cold facts instead of true closure. Even if the full picture never feels complete, the truth remains right there. Residual evidence remains identifiable patterns and hard truths buried beneath the noise, and in this specific case, those facts were crystallizing into a profile, proving the suspect acted with intent rather than impulse. Given the forensic evidence of comfort, familiarity, and execution, every movement indicated a perpetrator with intimate knowledge. This individual possessed inside information, operating with a tactical understanding of the physical environment and layout. They never hesitated, as if entering a foreign space, and that level of precision is never accidental. It stems from direct proximity and prolonged exposure, a deep-seated connection, even if it remains hidden from view. Forensic analysis suggested a structured operation, pointing toward the high probability of multiple conspirators working together. This was no chaotic blitz. It was a layered execution where specific roles were assigned and performed. A dynamic where one person executes while another directs explains the jarring inconsistencies found throughout the timeline. The conflicting data, a blend of rigid control and amateur mistakes, suggests a friction inherent when two minds collaborate. It is rarely seamless. Jagged edges remain where individual actions fail to align perfectly. Those gaps are revealing. However, the most critical forensic truth was simpler than that. The investigation was actually nearing a breakthrough, despite the surface-level appearance of a cold case or dead end. It appeared to be a mess of variables, but a clear structure was forming beneath the chaos. Hard data established patterns pointing toward a specific conclusion, and consistent indicators are impossible for detectives to ignore. Those leads demanded pursuit. Brian understood that high-stakes investigations rarely conclude with one loud, cinematic moment. Justice is not found in a sudden flash, it is painstakingly built, piece by piece, until the momentum shifts. A forensic link is established, a minor detail secures the timeline, and the incoherent mess begins to stabilize. The truth emerges not because it was buried, but because the investigator required time to observe the full profile. This case was accelerating not toward an explosive reveal, but toward a calculated, inevitable conclusion. When the final piece locks in, it will not surprise anyone. It will feel cold and predetermined. A reality that was always present, just out of focus. For now, the file remains open and active. It carries the crushing weight of unanswered questions, alongside the grim certainty that a resolution is firmly within reach. Solutions are out there close, stalking the right moment and the right set of eyes to break the tension. Once the silence breaks, the entire situation will permanently shift.